All right, how's it going, guys? So today, I know some of you aren't even on yet, but a lot of you have been asking how to break down the back leg of a deer. This is off of my most recent antelope, and so I'm going to do how to break down. It's going to be exactly the same. It's a little smaller than you would a deer, but all the cuts are going to be exactly the same on all your four-legged critters. So if it is a antelope, if it is a squirrel, if it's an elk, if it's a moose, it's all going to break down the same exact way. I always tell all the people that I teach in classes, if you look at all these white lines, that's a roadmap that God gave you to where all the muscle groups are. So we'll start off right here, removing this primary stake here. This is your top, or your eye of round, you'll hear people call you. Me, I like to call it just that center stake. It's a lot easier to teach people when you're just telling them the stakes versus like actually the names and stuff like that, because most of the times people don't even know the names. And they don't really understand the names anyway. This antelope was pretty fatty. So all we're gonna do is we're gonna break down in there. We're gonna start to separate that muscle group that sets right in there. I like to kind of get in there and not use too many knives once I start to break stuff down, just to separate. Just seems to make it a lot easier when you're going in there and doing stuff, to be able to get in there and see the different muscle groups that are a part of it. As you can see, as it just splits up, the muscles just fall apart. You're gonna follow that line all the way down. It's gonna go all the way down to there. So we're gonna keep our knife, just the tip of our knife. If you wanna use a smaller knife, if you've got a Havalon, if you've got a silverware, if you've got a smaller fillet, I've got a smaller fillet right over here that I can use to get in there too, but just using just that tip of that knife and following that around. This antelope's still a little frozen, but it's thawed enough for the purposes that we need it to be done for this. I like my meat to be cold anyway when I butcher. It's just easier to fall apart. I'm gonna keep working that sharp knife all the way in there, separating those muscles as you go along. It's super simple. Again, if you let the tip of the knife do the work and you follow the guidelines that God gave you, the whole thing is just gonna fall apart. So if you see where I'm getting up this top, see how the white line comes right there? The mistake a lot of people do is they start to cut into this shank muscle. The shank is gonna be completely different, a different muscle. This little eye that I'm pulling off right here, it just sits on top of that shank muscle. And you can see it's gonna go this way. And you're just gonna continue along that line of separating out that steak. Again, if you guys have any questions, ask. This is your perfect time to ask. So here's that other line on the other side. So as we flip it over, that line is actually gonna be right there. See it? Right there. So we're gonna come in right there and finish taking off the steak right at that line. It's pretty easy. Okay. Next one you've got up here, you've got your knuckle roast on top. You've got your sirloin steaks over there. This is, I like to call it a little hidden tenderloin. Again, it's one of those little eye steaks. We can remove that one real quick because it's gonna sit all by itself right in that little corner. Again, you're letting the knife and gravity do work. You're pulling, allowing the muscle to separate. As you can see, you can actually see my fingers down there in between there now. So we're not gonna hack. A lot of guys will get in there with their knives and just start hacking at stuff. All we're doing is separating those muscle groups. We want those even, clean cuts. I get asked all the time, how do you make your steaks look so perfect? How do you make them look so uniform and round? It's just right there, right? There's no cut marks in that. It's a perfect chunk of steak that was set there. Get off some of this undesirables, as I call it. All right, this steak is still kind of frozen, so we'll use a little bigger knife. But this is your main bone right here. Okay, so your femur bones, your leg bones are gonna go down from knuckle to knuckle right here. These are your 2 points. That bone's gonna run right along this line here, top to bottom. Once we separate this off, we're gonna come in here, we can take this whole steak off with it, but we're gonna cut right where that bone is, straight down into it, down until you hit the bottom bone itself. Then we're gonna follow the bone, and we're gonna cut this steak, this roast, off that bone. And again, when it's not frozen or partially frozen, it's a lot easier. It'll come off a lot smoother. But since it froze on me in my trip, this has been in the cooler for 4 days trying to thaw out, and I have to get it done because I don't have any more time to do it. So, do you cut steaks before you freeze it or after? That is a great question. I'm a big advocate on only cutting when you need it. So if you know for a fact that you want certain steak cuts, then yeah, cut them beforehand. But if you want, once you cut it, it's cut. So if I was to cut this roast right now and be done with it, the problem is that if I want to go back and make a roast, I can't go back and make a roast because it's already cut into steaks. But if I pull that roast out and I want to cut steaks, then I can pull that roast out and I can make steaks. So again, it's all based on your preference. For me, I like to keep as much stuff whole as I can, unless for a fact I know I'm gonna go in there and I've got some steak ideas or recipes in mind for what I want. Then I will totally go in there and cut up my steaks. And I'll show you guys how to cut up some steaks there. So that's gonna be that little football roast that everyone talks about, right? Up here is your knuckle. Flip this over so you can kind of see it a little bit here. So here's that knuckle right up here. We're gonna take that knuckle off. That's your knuckle roast. Okay. Then we're gonna get into the sirloin and the shank itself. Again, it doesn't take much time or much effort to butcher. It's just following that roadmap and understanding where all the parts are. There's a sciatic nerve that runs here with a lymph node. The lymph node's gonna sit right here on almost all critters, on your deer, on all that stuff. When it's frozen, it's a lot easier to get that lymph node out, as well as that sciatic nerve that runs up this back leg, just for the fact that it's all frozen. You don't have to worry about cutting and popping. Just use your pictures. So use that sharp knife, your fingers, and you can sit there and pull that lymph node without cutting right off and right out. So that lymph node is actually going to set right inside of there. If I start pulling that fat away, you can see it. That dark spot right there. I'm not gonna go and cut that, because if I do that, I gotta go wash my knives and clean my knives, because it will ruin the taste of all the meat. But that is where it sits. And again, now I got that whole nerve out, got that whole lymph node that sits right there. We can see these two muscles fall apart. What knives do I use? I got a lot of custom knives. Otherwise, this Kershaw 9-inch scimitar curved blade is my absolute favorite. And then I have a really nice Wusthof that has really good flex and bend to it, so I can get in there and get a lot of that silver on without ruining a lot of the meat, because a lot of guys will leave a lot of stuff on silver wise on their meat. So we're going to come in this, and here's that bone. We're going to do that same thing that we did with the other steak. Again, when it's not frozen, it's just going to fall off super easy, but I work with what I got for you guys. And we're gonna go around that little knuckle again, which is the top of that bone, keeping it as tight as we can. Coming right here, this is where it's gonna curve. You can see where the bone comes up. We're just gonna trim that straight into it. We're not gonna cut that other muscle, as you can see. Now it all starts falling away like it's supposed to. There's that top. See how clean the bone is, even when it's frozen. Now, again, sit there and people will throw that away. But I take all my bones, and I will take, actually I've got a dull knife for that. This is my scraping knife. It's dull, I don't sharpen it, so I don't have to worry about it. And I'll sit there and pull all that meat off of these bones. I have a saying that it's just another meatball. So everything we pull off, you can get all that, and it can be just another meatball in there. So it's kind of nice to do that. Then I'll take these bones and I'll crack them, and then that's what I'll use for my stock or give them to the dogs. But I don't usually give any bones to the dogs. I'll give them like esophaguses, I give them lungs and that kind of stuff. Bones I use for stocks, and once we cook it, we don't want to give our dogs cooked bones because it breaks it and brittle, and our dogs can choke and all that good jazz. So we'll reserve this lower shank. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna fold this together, and you're gonna be able to see that there's gonna be two parts of this. There's an upper part, and where that hinge bone is gonna come into there. So what we're gonna do is we wanna the misconception a lot of people do is they start to hack at this when we actually wanna go from the inside and then work it down. So fold that up to you, as you can see, fold it, and that's where you're gonna cut down into there. And if you fold it up to you, you'll actually see, you'll be able to cut right into where the bone itself is. So instead of coming from this way and hacking and trying to find your joint, coming from that underneath part, and you can see that's the actual muscle joint right there. Take that nice boning knife, break those tendons on each side. Take it. I usually go off the edge of the table. Use your body force. You're not breaking the bone, you're just separating it. As you can see there. Then just coming in and finishing that cut off. So as I said before, a lot of guys come in and hack, and they try to get underneath this bone right here. The problem is that's where that whole mechanism works. Okay, that's where the whole bone's working. So if we actually come from the other side, we're coming on the top side where all those bones are just attached. Okay, and again, this is going to go in the stock. We have our shank, which will trim up a little bit. You can use this shank for ossobuco. You can use this shank for slow cooking it, pulling it for tacos or enchiladas or whatever else pulled meats you want. Keeping it all here. There's a misconception. A lot of people think this is actually silver skin on this, right? Or there's silver skin up here. On this back leg itself, there's only one area where there's actually silver skin, and that's that very first steak that we cut off. Okay? You can see the difference in the color. Did I age this? No, I just froze it because a bunch of people, how do you crack those bad boys open? Saw? Nope. Just using muscle and finding where the joints are attached. Like I was telling you, that bone itself is going to sit in here, the pocket. Understanding how that bone works and where it sits in that pocket is easy to do it without any bone saws. Because when you're in the middle of the field, no one's got bone saws out if you're hunting in the West like us. You've just got your sheer muscle. But one way to know if it's silver or not, so one thing that I was taught is if your sharp knife, you run it across it and it doesn't cut it open. Okay, it made a little nick, but it didn't cut that open. That's silver. That's stuff that your body isn't going to digest. But one cool thing is you can take all that silver skin and scrape it off, and then take that silver skin and throw it in like your pressure cooker, and actually it'll pull all the rest of the meat off, all the rest of the sinew off. And there's really no waste in that. So that's your only spot that's going to be there, right? It doesn't cut. Now, if I was to take this muscle where we talked about where people were saying that same thing as silver, and I run my knife across it, it cuts, okay? It cut all the way up through. I didn't do any other pressure, right? This is just a sharp knife going over the top of it, and it's cutting open. This is telling you that this does not need to be removed. This will break down in your cooking, especially if you're doing that slow cooking. So don't sit there and pick at this, and pick at this, pick at this, pick at this, pick at this, and waste all your meat, okay? Easy, easy. That's one way to remember it. Whenever I teach classes, that's what I teach them. If your knife goes over it and it doesn't cut it, then take it off. So we'll trim up this football roast or this top, okay? Taking off some of just this fascia that's on top and making it look pretty and presentable. If you grind that, no. There's some parts that, yeah, if you want to trim off, like any of this fat, any of this negative stuff that is just gross and slimy, you can remove if you're grinding all that. All this fat right here, which is all bad fat, as you can see. Definitely remove all that. But getting there, removing every little single piece of that silver, it's not really going to affect your meat. But if you want to, go for it. But again, you're going to be wasting way more meat than you're actually doing it. Do you cut around the large tendons to leave it? Can you? Yeah, it'll help break it up. But do you need to? No, because the tendons themselves, pardon me, will actually become really stiff and tight. And so when you're actually cooking it, all that stuff's going to break down and it's all going to start falling off those tendons, just like you would any bones. So there's really no reason to do that. Inside here, if you're going to cut up this one for steaks, again, trimming off some of this negative fat and that kind of stuff. But in here, there's a couple different muscles, which you can see. You've got 1, 2, 3 muscles, and then you have this little muscle that sits on the bottom. If you're going to cook this as a roast, leave that there. If you're going to cut this as a steak, this is something you want to take out because there is a tendon that runs through there that does kind of act to a chewy thing. And so again, if this was softer, it's still solid from where I kept it frozen. I would actually take out that center part and cut this into steaks to show you guys, but I might as well just show you what a steak would look like, since I've got a couple of antelope to do. Key thing is 1 to 2 fingers is about the average cut that you would get on a steak. So that would be a steak. And in here, that's that little piece that I talked to you that you would pull off, okay? Right out of that little center part, which as you can see, it's got that negative that runs through it. Then you have your nice steak that sits there. And if you look on this one, this would be that little piece that we're going to pull out there. So negative, positive, negative, positive. But again, all this is not waste. All this can go into your soups, can go into your slow cooking, because again, all that's going to shred off, all that's going to fall away. So don't just throw those away. Save them. But that's how you would get your steak cuts out of this roast right up here. To trim up your knuckle roast, this is the one that sat on top of that roast we just cleaned up. There's going to be a vein of fat that runs through it, as well as a tendon or a nerve that runs right through that center there. So we're going to trim that up. Best way to do this is to just kind of take your sharp knife and go against that and start to pull. As you can see, that's where that fat's lying. And I'm not going in here hacking at this, right? It might take a little longer, might be a little more methodical, but it's going to be a lot less meat waste. I will watch a lot of these YouTube videos and I watch these guys just hacking at meat, and a lot of you are going to follow them, which is great. You're learning how to butcher. But by taking your time and understanding how the meat works, you're going to waste a lot less. And even with this, you can come in there and take that knife and go along the top of where that fat was. Roll it. I always teach my class the rolling method. Roll that meat off. All the negative is going to stay, while all the good shreds away. Okay? So again, if you think about those other pieces that I cut off, right? I'm just making more meatballs. That's it. That's all I'm doing. All that's going to go in my grind, except for this. This is going to go into that stock making. It's going to add nice flavor. It's gonna render down. It's gonna add some nice color to my stalks. Then we'll just finish trimming up any of this bloodshot, any of this negative space that's in here. We'll trim all that away. And again, I'll sit here and pick at all of this, get off anything that I don't want. And we'll finish that up just like that. Then you've got this little knuckle. Cool thing you can do with this knuckle roast is you can cut this off. You can pull it out, and you can make asada type cuts with it. So if you cut this really, really thin, I'll show you in just a second. Let's do that roll method so we're not wasting a bunch of meat, getting off what I like to call the undesirables, the unedibles. Okay. So again, I'm not hacking. I'm just working the tool, the knife, for what I have. But you can actually take this whole steak here, cut it in half, and use this as you would any sort of beef asada, okay? So making your fajitas out of this, grilling this up, it's got great texture, falls apart really, really, really easy, right? And so all that it takes really good marinade. It's really tender because it's that knuckle that sits on top. With this little eye that sits right here, again, all we're doing is just taking off that negative fat. This is going to have that same look and kind of texture as the tenderloin when it's cooked. It's a little tougher than that tenderloin down south, but for the most part, you'll be able to utilize it exactly the same. There's not much trimming on this, just getting off some of that fat. And again, using that rolling method, it's going to pull all the negatives away from the meat and leave all your positives and allow you to actually get in there. Again, see? Get in there and be able to pull that off versus cutting it off. Just makes for a prettier presentation. We have our sirloin over here. This one's going to have a top cap on this one. This top cap we're going to remove, and again, utilizing meat like you would for your beef. This is where you can again make some asada out of, make some different fun cuts out of, because it is a thinner cut that is a little more tender, and it'll sit right on top of that sirloin steak that you have. Okay, and that's just that little cap that sits right there. No real trimming needs to be done to this guy. Now, this is the cut. A lot of people ask me what I do with this cut. This is the primary cut that I use for most of my dishes. This is the cut that I will use to make my roast beef. This is the cut on elk and stuff that I'll utilize as like a brisket because of the cuts and textures. A lot of guys will take this and make this into steaks because it steaks out really, really well. If you are staking it out, you'll remove these two muscles and stake it out, or you can stake it out together, but these muscles are two separate. If you're leaving it whole like I do, I leave this whole roast whole, and I will cook it just like that, and it'll all shrink up together. And this is where I'll make a lot of my dinners out of, is this sirloin right here. And again, all we're doing is we're just trimming up that negative fat, anything that's sitting there that you don't want to eat or don't want to feed your family. But super simple to do, super easy. And again, if I pull this out and my family wants steaks, then I can cut steaks out of it just like that for dinner. But if I pull it out and I want a roast, but I've cut all my steaks out of it, then I'm pretty much screwed on what I can do with that dish from then on out. So I usually leave this whole just like this. Then we're gonna come up here. That nice square one that I talked about earlier. This is the one that sits between your top and bottom round, or your football roast, which a lot of hunters out there will call it. That's where that one's going to sit right here. How do you cut T-bone steaks, and what part of the animal does it come from? Great question, Gerard. T-bone steaks. So if you look at the rib cage itself, you've got your back strap that runs along the back of the animal. You've got your primary ribs that start here, and then there's that section between where the tail starts and where the ribs are. In there are just vertebrae, and in that vertebrae section is where you're going to get your T-bones. It's going to take, you're going to have your back strap on one end of that T-bone, on the other end you're going to have your tenderloin. So if you want to cut T-bones out of that, you cannot cut out your tenderloins, because your tenderloins are a primary source. That's the second half. That's your filet mignon. So if you think about, if you're getting a T-bone, you're getting a New York on top, a big chunk on New York, and then your bottom one is going to be your tenderloin or your filet mignon. So you have to leave that tenderloin on there. If you take off that tenderloin, you can't make T-bones. It's just physically impossible to do. So one way to get in here, get that sharp knife, kind of go underneath, angle your knife up. Okay. Finish that out, keeping that knife angled up. Making long strokes. And then I finish it off because I want it nice and square. But I watch a lot of guys throw this away because they take off that silver. Take that knife. You're going to come in here and you're just going to drag it along that bottom. You're going to pull off all that meat that sat on that silver. So now you can see what most guys throw away. All that meat is now going to go into my grind pile. Just another meatball, right? So we'll come in there, take that off. And we'll trim up this a little bit because this is also going to go in our grind pile or our stew. And this has got a big chunk of nasty on top. That's why I cut it off. And then I come in from the bottom and I flip this up just like that. Pretty and clean. Yuck, gross. But again, coming into all those sections and not wasting anything. Right? We just pulled off more grind for our grind pile. It's got this other one that runs right here on this other side. This one I just come in and do this rolling cut with it because it's on that soft side. So we're just going to roll down. Finish it off, make it look pretty. Now you can use this for steaks. You can use it whole. You can cut this open and make it, butterfly it and stuff it, which is a great recipe to do. So one thing I like to do is I like to make this my daughter's favorite recipe with this, both my daughters. We call it our pan-sear steaks. And that comes out of this cut right here. And I make these steaks just thin enough to throw in a hot cast iron and pan-sear. So again, we're looking at about that 2-finger mark. And then I've got this tip, which I will throw into our stew meat. And now I've got these beautiful little square steaks that we call them in our household. So season those heavily with whatever seasoning you want. Usually in our house, it's salt and pepper, a little bit of smoked paprika. Once that's really seasoned up real good, pat it in real good, we let it sit. I get a super hot cast iron skillet, put butter, avocado oil, rosemary and garlic, and kind of get a froth going. And then I put these in 45 seconds on each side just to get that char. And then my family just sits there and eats these, and it's like gold. I usually win over a lot of people that are anti-wild game with this cut right here and with that exact recipe that I just told you. And again, it doesn't take very long to do. So, steaks. I'm going to make some ossobuco out of that one. We got that little hidden tenderloin, which is one of my favorite cuts. Got all those square steaks that are in there, right? All those beautiful square steaks. Would have had that nice football style roast, but we cut steaks out of it, so I will finish cutting steaks out of this since I don't want to just have half a roast. I'm actually think I'm going to take this tonight and make some Philly cheesesteaks with that bad boy tonight. It's going to go sit on the Traeger for a little while. So we got our steaks in there. Got a whole pile for our ground, and that only took us not very long at all to do. And it's fun, and it's easy, and we know that our hands are the only hands that touched it, and we didn't pay a couple $100 extra to have a butcher do it for us. So I have some shoulders left in there, so tomorrow I will do a shoulder for you. And dude, I'm glad you liked your the super juice. I'm going to do the shoulder tomorrow. We'll do a live video shoulder tomorrow around lunchtime. And we'll show you guys how to get the proper cuts out of there and not just turn your whole shoulder into ground, because that's just a waste of shoulder. So talk to you guys later. Have a good one.